There is a version of Gia Carangi that arrives already edited, young, reckless, beautiful, doomed. Drugs took over, fashion moved on, AIDS ended the story at 26, and the Angelina Jolie film supplied the images most people remember. That version is familiar because it is easy to carry. It gives the tragedy a single owner. It turns a real woman into a warning label. The harder version begins earlier, before the hospital room and before the movie. It begins with a teenager from Philadelphia whose face became valuable faster than anyone around her knew how to protect her. It follows the adults and institutions that kept using the image after the person behind it was in trouble. It asks why the safest story about Gia has always been the one that leaves fashion least exposed. In 1980, Gia Carangi appeared on the cover of American Vogue. She was 20 years old and had been working in New York for roughly 2 years. That same year, she appeared on 2 covers of Vogue Paris. The year before, she had been on the cover of British Vogue. The year after, Vogue Italia. Around those covers, she was shooting for Versace with Richard Avedon, working with Francesco Scavullo for Cosmopolitan, and appearing in editorials shaped by Arthur Elgort, Helmut Newton, Albert Watson, and other photographers who defined the period. Her career did not need tragedy to make it look important. Gia reached the top tier while she was alive, while magazines were still hiring her, and while photographers still treated her face as something rare enough to build around. Scavullo described her camera presence as something that made photographers chase her, rather than arrange her. She moved like an actress, not like a model waiting to be placed. The business loved control. The angle, the light, the clothes, the finished illusion. Gia brought something less obedient into that system. She could make a staged picture feel caught in motion. That quality entered the industry's own private vocabulary. Early in Cindy Crawford's career, photographers agreed to meet her partly because she reminded them of Gia. The phrase was "baby Gia." It functioned as currency. It told people that Crawford had the kind of face, charge, and possibility that Gia had already made recognizable. Condé Nast Records placed Gia in several Vogue editorials in late 1978, photographed by Arthur Elgort and wearing designers including Calvin Klein, Oscar de la Renta, and John Anthony. She had been in New York for less than a year, moving with the speed of someone the industry already knew how to sell. The later film brought Gia's name to viewers far outside fashion, but the work came first. 5 Vogue covers, Cosmopolitan covers, Avedon, Scavullo, Elgort. A face that helped shift the mood toward something darker, more direct, harder to soften. The tragedy came later and covered that power. Gia Marie Carangi was born in Philadelphia on January 29, 1960. Her father, Joseph Carangi, ran restaurant businesses. Her mother, Kathleen, had her own history with fashion. As a teenager, Kathleen joined a department store modeling club, and later she worked around retail fashion shows. Long before New York turned Gia's face into a commodity, beauty and presentation were already part of the family's language. The household fractured while Gia was still a child. Joseph and Kathleen's marriage had serious conflict, and Kathleen left when Gia was around 11. Kathleen later said she kept seeing the children regularly, but Gia's brother Michael remembered that period as longer and more destabilizing. For Gia, the split seems to have landed less like one clean break and more like a confusion she had to live inside. A mother who was still present in one version of the family story and painfully absent in another. People who knew her before fame described a girl with far more range than damage. They remembered mischief, energy, humor, and a childlike openness that could sit beside guardedness. Sharon Beverly, one of her early partners, said there was always a real child in her. Photographer Joseph Petrellis said she moved in front of the camera like a cheetah. Maurice Tannenbaum remembered someone guarded, yet loving with children and family. Her teenage world had its own shape. In early 1970s Philadelphia, Gia moved through a Bowie-influenced scene where glam style, androgyny, and queer possibility gave young people another way to read themselves. She spent time at DCA, a Philadelphia gay dance club, and met Sharon Beverly there. In conversations with Sharon, Gia said she basically loved women, even if part of her still wished men could work for her emotionally. That testimony gives the story enough precision without forcing a modern label over it. By the time she finished high school after a delayed graduation in 1977, she was working around her father's businesses and being photographed locally by Tannenbaum and Petrellis. She joked that she wanted one Vogue cover to prove she could do it, then quit. The line survives because it sounds like Gia, ambitious, funny, a little dismissive of the things she wanted, as if wanting it too openly would give it too much power. Before the myth, there was a young woman with family complications, a queer social world, a quick mouth, and a face local photographers already knew how to follow. The later story often turns her childhood into an explanation for everything. A better account lets it remain a beginning, not a diagnosis. In February 1978, Gia moved to New York. She was 17. The move came after Maurice Tannenbaum's portfolio, built largely around photographs of Gia, reached someone connected to Wilhelmina Cooper's agency. Wilhelmina saw the pictures and moved quickly to sign her, even though Gia was underage and outside some standard measurements agencies usually wanted. The business saw value before it saw risk. Gia arrived with Sharon Beverly, moved into a small apartment, and began the daily routine of go-sees. Sharon later remembered that Gia found the city intimidating and the business cold. She felt like a piece of meat. At home, she could still be the girl who watched cartoons after spending the day in rooms where adults were, calculating what her face could sell. Gia's brother Michael later said the family made its biggest mistake by letting her go without someone beside her. That comment works best as an indictment of the system around her, not as a family accusation. There was no adult assigned to Gia's survival. No law required one. The agency could sign the teenager, clients could book her, photographers could shoot her, and every adult in the chain could benefit without carrying formal responsibility for what happened when the workday ended. The rules built that gap in. New York extended child performer-style protections to underage models only in 2013. Broader workplace protections for models in the state took effect only in 2025 through the Fashion Workers Act. Gia entered the business decades before that language existed. Models were commonly treated as independent contractors, outside many protections ordinary employees could claim. Wilhelmina Cooper became one of Gia's strongest attachments in New York. People around Gia described warmth between them, and the relationship took on a mother-shaped importance in a city where Gia had very little steady protection. Some stories about their closeness grew larger over time, as stories like that often do. What holds steady is simpler. Wilhelmina made Gia feel seen by someone powerful in a business that usually treated young women as faces first and people second. Wilhelmina died in March 1980. Gia felt the loss deeply, and it landed at a dangerous time. By then, she had reached the upper level of fashion, had thin support outside work, and was moving through a nightlife world where hard drugs were easy to find. The loss removed one of the few people in New York who seemed to make Gia feel protected. By the time Gia came to elite model management, her problems were circulating through the professional world. Studio talk already included her drug use. Elite president Monique Pillard asked to see Gia's forearms during the signing process. Gia refused. Elite signed her anyway. The concern clearly existed. The value still won. Gia's image remained profitable enough that people were willing to work around the signs of harm. Scavolo's role shows the same pattern with more detail. During a trip to St. Bart's, his assistant Sean Burns found Gia's drugs and threw them overboard. Later, when Gia was close to unemployable, Scavolo still hired her for a Cosmopolitan cover. The Los Angeles Times described the shoot being arranged so visible damage to her hands would stay out of the final image. The cover ran. The photograph survived. The condition of the person who made it stayed outside the frame. What happened around Gia was quieter than a conspiracy and more ordinary than anyone wants to admit. People kept finding ways to make the image work. A hand hidden, a shoot adjusted, a booking accepted even when warning signs were already there. Any one of those choices could be explained as loyalty, hope, business, or denial. Together, they show a system that knew how to protect the photograph better than the person making it. The people who pushed hardest for real help mostly came from outside the work itself. Gia's family pushed. Rochelle Silver pushed. Gia entered Eagleville Hospital in Pennsylvania twice, first in late 1984 and again in early 1985. There, she began intensive therapy and formed a close friendship with Rob Fay. She tried to get better. The fact that recovery did not hold does not erase the effort it took to begin. Her addiction has often been folded into a clean, almost too convenient story. Someone pulled her into hard drugs, and the rest followed from there. Gia had experimented before New York, but her use grew heavier after fashion placed her inside a world of late nights, fast money, adult rooms, and easy access. By the early 1980s, substance dependency had started showing up around her career and her health. No reliable account gives the story one clear starting point or one person to blame. That leaves the harder question. How many people saw enough to worry, then kept working around it because the image could still be used? Some cared about Gia. Some needed the job finished. Some probably convinced themselves those two things could exist side by side. In fashion, that was often enough to keep the machine moving. When Gia became ill, AIDS was still surrounded by fear, stigma, and public confusion. The CDC had reported the first AIDS cases in women in January 1983. By September 1984, Federal health authorities had identified the major routes of HIV transmission and ruled out ordinary casual contact. The medical picture was getting clearer. The public conversation was still catching up, slowly and often badly. Women with AIDS were poorly served by both the official definitions and the way the disease was discussed. The CDC expanded its AIDS surveillance definition in 1993 to include conditions that better captured women and people who injected drugs. Gia died 7 years before that change. Her illness unfolded in a period when women could be sick, visible, and still badly misread by the systems counting the epidemic. Rock Hudson's public AIDS announcement in July 1985 increased media attention. Coverage grew after his death that October, but attention did not bring understanding overnight. AIDS reporting still carried panic, homophobia, and a narrow idea of who the disease belonged to. Gia lived at the intersection of several stigmas at once: queer life, substance dependency, visible physical decline, and a disease the culture was still learning to name without contempt. Even the timeline around her diagnosis has never settled into one clean version. One account places a 1986 hospital admission with pneumonia and an ARC diagnosis near the end of her life. ARC meant AIDS-related complex, a term used at the time for HIV-related illness outside the full CDC definition of AIDS. Other accounts place an AIDS diagnosis in December 1985. Either way, by 1986, Gia was seriously ill. She was hospitalized in Philadelphia that year with multiple AIDS-related symptoms. On November 18, 1986, she died at Hahnemann University Hospital. She was 26. The exact route of HIV transmission has never been confirmed publicly. Gia had a history of injection drug use, and shared injection equipment is a known route of HIV transmission. Sexual transmission is also a known route. Her case has often been reduced to a simple drug use explanation, but that turns medical risk into certainty and makes the story easier to judge than to understand. That shortcut placed her illness inside a moral story about consequence. Gia became sick during an era when knowledge, stigma, addiction, sexuality, and fear were all colliding. That is the world that shaped how she was treated, how she was remembered, and how much of her final illness was documented with care. In 1998, HBO released Gia, directed by Michael Christopher and written by Christopher with Jay McInerney. Angelina Jolie played Gia with Faye Dunaway, Elizabeth Mitchell, and Mercedes Rahel in key roles. Jolie's performance won major awards and carried Gia's name far beyond fashion circles. The film introduced her to people who had never seen the covers. It also brought lesbian desire, drug addiction, and AIDS grief into mainstream television at a time when those subjects still carried heavy stigma. HBO's version did not come from Stephen Frears' book. Paramount held those rights, so the film was built through interviews, modeling world memory, and help from Janice Dickinson that gave it texture. It also meant the movie carried the shape of remembered stories, not a full historical record. The result was powerful television. It was also selective. People were combined, timelines tightened, private moments imagined, and emotional scenes built to make Gia's life legible in 2 hours. That is how biopics work. The trouble comes later, when the performance becomes the version people trust most. For many viewers, Jolie's Gia became Gia. Her performance had so much force that it began to feel like evidence. Public memory gathered around volatility, romance, drug use, illness, and death. The career moved into the background. Philadelphia became setup. The industry became scenery. People's 25th anniversary coverage of the film shows how durable that framing became. Gia's story was retold through Jolie's performance, the HBO cast, and the tragic ending. The movie had reached more people than the archives ever did, so its version kept traveling. That shift also changed the emotional assignment. Viewers were invited to know Gia through the scenes that hurt most, then carry those scenes back over the real woman. A crying face, a drug scene, a hospital ending. Those became easier to remember than a working model. The movie gave people an entry point. It also taught many of them which parts of Gia to look for first whenever her name appeared again in articles, retrospectives, and online social media summaries later. The film gave Gia visibility. It also fixed her inside a narrower shape. The woman who had once been a working reference point inside fashion became, for many people, the character Angelina Jolie played. Easier to feel for, harder to separate from the drama built around her. Fashion did not need a formal decision to make Gia's memory smaller. It happened through what kept getting repeated and what kept getting left out. The easiest version stayed close to the surface: beauty, drugs, collapse, death. The harder parts pointed back at the business itself: labor conditions, adult access, queer stigma, and the commercial use of a 17-year-old who was already in trouble. AIDS brought its own silence into fashion. In Vogue's oral history of the epidemic, hairstylist Guerin remembered the industry keeping itself in motion, Vanity Fair wrote in 1987 that fashion was accused of keeping its blinders on, partly because brands feared consumer panic around AIDS. The CFDA has also described how deaths during that era were sometimes announced under other causes, like pneumonia, even when AIDS was behind them. That was the atmosphere around Gia's final years. People knew pieces, people avoided certain words. People protected the finished surface because the finished surface was the business. Fashion did become more public about AIDS later. Seventh on Sale, organized by Vogue and the CFDA, launched in 1990 and raised money for AIDS organizations. Gia died in 1986, before that public phase arrived. She belonged to the earlier, quieter period, when silence still felt safer than statement. The version that survived asked very little of the people around her. Beautiful girl, bad choices, dead at 26. The summary is familiar because it is simple, and the simplicity does most of the hiding. It hides the teenager arriving in New York without the protections underage models would only gain decades later. It hides the independent contractor structure, the warning signs seen in studios, the shoots adjusted around visible damage, and the uncertain timeline around her diagnosis. It hides the fact that women with AIDS were still being misread by the systems meant to count them. It also hides Gia's queer life, which shaped her relationships but fit badly inside the version of beauty mainstream fashion preferred to remember. A cautionary tale needs a clean lesson. Gia's life never gave one. Her choices had consequences, and addiction damaged her work and health. The business also kept using her image while responsibilities stayed scattered, optional, and easy to avoid. That part is harder to package, which may be why it was so often pushed aside. Gia also sits awkwardly in later supermodel history. Her peak came before the word supermodel became the polished 1990s brand. The women who followed her could be sold as disciplined professionals, global celebrities, and business figures. Gia belonged to an earlier bridge between editorial mystery and mass celebrity. Her career was short, unstable, and difficult to place beside cleaner success stories. So her work is often mentioned after her death, when it should have been the first thing said. Her covers belong to fashion history. Her decline asks who was watching while that history was being made around her. The people close to Gia remembered more than chaos. They remembered humor, need, loyalty, anger, charm, guardedness, and a softness that came out most clearly around children and family. Addiction made her hard to reach and sometimes hard to be near, but it never erased the person they had known before the worst years took over. The wild child label flattened her in a different way. It turned unpredictability into personality when some of it came from pain, some from survival, and some from a business that liked the edge as long as it photographed well. Fashion could use that charge when it made the picture stronger. Later, the same charge became an easy explanation for why everything collapsed. Gia's relationships with women were part of her life before they became part of anyone else's interpretation. She moved through queer spaces, loved women, and spoke about that desire to people close to her. She did not leave behind a polished public statement about identity, because she was not living for a future documentary panel. She left relationships, memories, and remarks that show a young woman whose desire sat outside the straight image fashion often preferred to sell. That part of her life became even harder to hold once AIDS entered the story. Women who loved women were often pushed to the edges of public AIDS narratives, while people with drug dependency were treated as warnings before they were treated as patients. Gia stood in both places at once. Her queerness could be heightened for drama, softened in summaries, or treated like a scandalous detail instead of a basic part of who she was. Her work cuts through that narrowing. Baby Gia became a compliment, while people inside fashion still remembered what she could do in front of a camera. Cindy Crawford's early comparison shows Gia's influence moving through the industry before her death had turned her name into a tragic reference that should change the ending. Gia fell from a real career, a real social world, and a real network of people who loved, used, helped, misunderstood, and sometimes failed her. Blaming every adult around her would only create another shortcut. Letting the industry disappear behind her addiction creates the older, easier one. Gia made choices that hurt her work, her body, and people who loved her. Addiction narrowed what those choices could look like. Fashion kept rewarding the image even as the person became harder to manage. What remains is no clean moral, only the harder question of what people do when a valuable face belongs to someone in pain. Gia's story is often told like a chain reaction. Childhood pain becomes rebellion, rebellion becomes drugs, drugs become AIDS, AIDS becomes the ending. The whole life gets reduced to a line that feels easy to follow because it leaves so little room for anyone else. Her family history shaped her, but it cannot carry the whole explanation. Substance dependency damaged her work, her health, and the people trying to reach her. That damage grew inside a world of money, late nights, adult rooms, and easy access. The collapse looks personal only when the rooms around her disappear. Gia arrived in New York at 17 and became valuable almost immediately. Fashion knew how to use a teenage model before it had any real structure for protecting one. Once she began to unravel, people saw pieces of it. Some tried to help, some kept booking her, some managed to do both and call it care. That is the part the warning label version cannot hold. It asks Gia to carry a story with many hands on it. It lets addiction explain what labor conditions, AIDS stigma, family pressure, queer erasure, and industry convenience also help shape. The system fades into the background, and one young woman is left standing in front of it. Gia was never a simple victim, and she was never the monster the harsher versions sometimes imply. She was talented, impulsive, wounded, funny, difficult, loved, and sometimes frighteningly alone. She could be magnetic in front of a camera and exhausting in real life. She could want rescue and push it away. That does not erase the work she made, and it does not erase the adults who kept treating a collapsing person as a difficult booking problem. Fashion has never handled this part well. Gia's beauty is easy to remember. Her destruction is easy to dramatize. The space between those two things is harder because it contains workrooms, agencies, magazines, photographers, clients, hospitals, lovers, family, and a public health crisis that punished people for being the wrong kind of sick. The system did not need a secret plot to fail her. A teenager could become a commodity before she became protected. A sick model could still produce a usable cover. A queer woman with AIDS could be remembered more comfortably as a drug tragedy than as part of a larger failure. The machinery ran on habits, incentives, silence, and the belief that an image could be separated from the person who made it. Gia's face could be bought, styled, lit, retouched, circulated, and remembered. Her needs were harder to sell. Her queerness complicated the fantasy. Her addiction complicated the glamour. Her illness complicated the nostalgia. So the story kept shrinking until it fit inside a familiar warning. Her professional record belongs near the front of her life, not tucked behind the hospital scene. The work came first. The industry recognized her power while she was still alive, long before the collapse became easier to repeat. What remains is a life with fewer easy exits. Gia Carangi built something real, then became trapped inside stories that made her easier to pity than to understand. Pity asks very little. Understanding asks who benefited while she was still beautiful enough to book, who looked away when the damage became visible, and why the simplest version kept surviving long after the facts made it harder to defend. Gia Carangi's story has been repeated through beauty, addiction, illness, and blame. Each retelling kept the easy parts close and left the harder questions at the edge. The woman inside that story was gifted, vulnerable, funny, difficult, queer, ambitious, and young. She built a real career before the tragedy hardened around her name. She also lived inside a business that wanted the image long before it had language for responsibility. What happened after that belonged to more than Gia alone. Addiction was hers to live through, but the conditions around it were shared. Illness was hers to endure, but the stigma around it was public. The image was hers, but fashion kept using it long after the person behind it needed more than work. The warning label version is easier to store away. The fuller version is harder because it leaves more people in the room. Gia deserved that fuller record. So did the work she made before everyone learned how to remember the ending.